Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. Today we are highlighting one of the earliest black elected officials in American history and somebody who actually made a pretty significant midnight ride, similar to Paul Revere. We're talking about Wentworth Cheswell, and the Cheswell family has a pretty interesting history, as many of the heroes we've covered up to this point have. His grandfather was a slave who was able to achieve his freedom in 1717. Then he became the first black man to actually own property in New Hampshire. His father was Hope Still Cheswell. I'm so glad you're here, because I was thinking Hope Cheswell, but that wasn't quite right. Hope Still Cheswell, and he became a significant carpenter who actually built homes for several noted patriot leaders, including John Paul Jones. If you remember the ship captain, I've not yet begun to fight, that guy, he built his home. The Reverend Samuel Langdon, another noted pastor from the founding era. And so Wentworth is growing up around a lot of these revolutionary leaders. And when he actually decides to get an education, to attend academy on some level, he gets training in a lot of noted things, including Greek and Latin. But interestingly enough, in New Hampshire, actually gets trained in swimming, which doesn't seem like to be the normal activity of schools in general. Most people in the founding era couldn't swim, so kudos for him getting swim lessons right at that point in his life. However, as his life goes on, he gets very involved in his church. When he's 21 years old, he and his wife get married and have a pretty large family.
I would say so. So Mary Davis, his wife, has 13 children. So 4 sons.
Yes.
And all the rest of them were girls.
9 daughters. Yeah. So kudos to them, right? Well done. And this was also at an era when it was not unusual, unheard of for there to be infant mortality, death in childbirth, or the mother to actually die giving childbirth. So this is actually a big deal, giving birth to that many kids. And he became very involved in his local church, so much so that he actually ended up buying a pew, because back then a tithe was a little different then than it is now. And it was kind of the standard practice that the way you would support the church and the pastor is you would purchase a pew for a year, and sometimes longer. You could have an endowment and have it forever. But
he needed it with that family.
Yeah. Yes, he and his wife and 13 kids, actually maybe 2 pews, right? We need even more space. But in the midst of this, he became a noted leader in the town, and he is a black man living in a white town, and yet he's elected to political office by the white community, which seems kind of impressive.
Oh, he wasn't just elected to certain positions within a predominantly white community. He was elected over a period of almost 50 years to numerous different positions that I'll begin to read off here. So first he was the town constable. Then he was also elected town selectman of the town's executive council. He was the coroner, 6 years as an assessor, and 7 years as the town moderator. Most importantly, I think, is the fact that he served 12 years as the justice of the peace of that particular town. Now, why is that so significant? That's so significant because we're talking about the 1770s and up, right? This is a time when slavery is not over for part of the country. And here we have a predominantly white community electing Wentworth Cheswell to be the justice of the peace and preside over these cases of equity for that population. Additionally, we have in our collection at the American Journey Experience a particular summons that he sent out requiring that someone appear at his personal home, his residence, to administer justice to that person. A black man's home back then in the 1770s and 80s. That's absolutely incredible and unheard of.
Well, and it's unheard of, especially in the narrative today, but it's worth noting, when you look back in early America, there were a lot of Christian communities like the Pilgrims who had a different mindset when it came to equality. And especially when you look at the northern colonies in America, so many of those colonies were founded on biblical principles by Christian leaders, really by pastors. And some of them were like church congregations. And so especially in northern communities, this was not unheard of behavior. It's just not really well reported behavior today. And it's also worth noting when we talk about early elected officials, he's not even the first black man elected to public office in America. For that, go back to the 1640s, right? With Matthias de Souza and Maryland elected the state legislature. There's a lot more to the story of the race issue in America, or some of the black heroes in America, than what most people know. And certainly it's different than a lot of the CRT 1619 narrative. And Wentworth Cheswell is a great guy to dispel so many of those notions with just one story. But as you mentioned, for 49 years, he serves in public office. If you start breaking down what he was doing during those years, it's pretty fascinating what all he did and where he contributed. Because like even during the American Revolution, he's a pretty noted guy.
Yeah, so we all have heard of Paul Revere's midnight ride, right? Well, Wentworth Cheswell actually did something exactly that, right? So he was actually selected by the town to serve for their committee of safety, which would carry intelligence from one camp to the other to let citizens know that the British are coming. So he was actually one of those people that were going on this ride. So it really speaks to his patriotism.
Well, and when we look at the American Revolution, it's, we often hear the name Paul Revere, and we forget, like, even that night, Paul Revere wasn't the only guy who even rode that night. William Dawes was that night, and we know over the course of the Revolution, there were many people who made these rides. And so when you're talking about people making these famous Paul Revere-like rides, and we could go to Sybil Ludington, right, the 16-year-old girl who makes a ride, or Wentworth Cheswell, this black patriot and leader, and he actually contributes during the American Revolution more than just this famous midnight ride. He was part of the Light Horse Cavalry with John Langdon, Colonel John Langdon, and they participated in the Battle of Saratoga, which was the first major victory for the Americans in the American Revolution. He's a part of what's going on there. And this is where, arguably, that's not why he was elected to any office whatsoever, but he's a part of significant things going along. His name is well known where he is in New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, one of the jobs he has is he's kind of like the town historian, and he begins collecting information and documenting the history. So if you go to the history of New Hampshire, we have a 3-volume set here at WallBuilders of the history of New Hampshire. And the guy who put that together actually gives credit to Wentworth Cheswell, thanking him for what he did in compiling so much information that the reason they know as much as they do about New Hampshire was because of contributions from people like Wentworth Cheswell. This was a guy that even the history of New Hampshire noted, had it not been for some of what he did in town records and contributions, we wouldn't know as much as we did. And so when we start looking big picture about a guy who is a black man, large family, the white community looked at him and respected him enough that they said, this is the guy we want to represent us. It reminds me of what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, where his dream was one day that people would not look at the color of skin, but they could judge someone by the content of their character. The only way you get elected 49 years in a row, might be a little different now with like a Nancy Pelosi, right? Joe Biden, I feel differently now.
Yeah.
Back in that era, right, the only way you still get elected is because they recognized there was something different about his character.
Absolutely. And so looking at that, we can see that defeats a lot of narratives that are pushed today, right? We see with the 1619 Project and how we've grabbed the words of MLK Jr. and saying we want to judge people off the content of their character. Now we don't do that any longer. We judge people off the color of their skin. We judge people off of immutable character traits that don't actually show the inherent virtue and integrity of every individual. And that's something that we have to change and get back to. The reason why Wentworth Cheswell was elected for 49 years straight in his community was because he was a man of integrity, was because he was a man that they could trust to be their coroner, someone that they could trust to do all these jobs of public service because they knew that he would hold himself accountable because of his beliefs.
Well, and to that end, right, this is also where they recognize that it's someone that's capable, someone that has the ability. It reminds me a little bit of Exodus 18:21, when Jethro is helping Moses, like, let's think through this. You should choose able men, capable men that fear God, men of truth that hate covetousness. Nothing in God's standard has to do with the color of somebody's skin, but it does matter that they have ability, because even integrity, you have to have integrity, but you can have integrity and no skill, right? You could. He was able to improve and develop himself in so many ways that even other citizens looked and they're like, that guy can do stuff we can't do. He's so good at this. He's so good at that. And he's a great example of someone, when you look at his family legacy, right? Literally, his grandfather being a slave, but then finding freedom, the first black man to own property in New Hampshire, his father becoming a skilled carpenter, building homes for noted founding fathers. Now he is in a place of really kind of power in a lot of ways in New Hampshire, in 3 generations in America, because there was opportunity, because he had freedom to pursue this, and because he developed the skills and abilities. He was a man of character and integrity. He was able, arguably, to accomplish and achieve the American dream. And it's one of the things that's so fun to go back and look at these stories and see who these people were, to see the contributions they made. And especially if we hear the modern narrative today, the only way you can overcome a lie is with the truth. And in order for us to know the truth, we have to go back and see what really happened, who was really there, and even who were some of the leaders of that time. And when you begin to see the leaders, for example, of New Hampshire, the leader of this area was Wentworth Cheswell, one of the major leaders of that time. This is when you begin to see the truth is very different than the modern narrative being pushed. If you want to know more about Wentworth Cheswell, go to WallBuilders.com. We have information on him there. At the end of all these articles, we always have the footnotes. You can go and look some of these up, and there's way more to his story than even what we included in this short article. But it's a starting place, and if you want to know more about some of these great American heroes, as always, just tune into the next episode of One Room Schoolhouse.